Recording with progress.
Welcome to today. My name is Kurt Runzheimer, and I'll introduce myself as I go along. But as you read, we're here to talk about honeybees and other pollinators. All right, well, the people on Zoom out there, including my mother and father-in-law. All right, great. So I'll just start in on slides, and then I'll introduce a little bit as we do those. And I thought to kind of divide into loose sections. At the end of each section, I could ask if anybody has any questions about that pertaining to what we just talked about. We'll go through and look at quite briefly what I do as a beekeeper, etc. And then we'll look a little bit about the actual pollinators in general, honeybees as pollinators, and then look at the specifics of honeybees and what they are in the hive a little bit, etc. So, and at the very end, if we didn't have some section that would pertain to your question, we could ask it. I'm good. So, all right, great. So this is just a presentation I just told a perspective on honeybees. My life as a beekeeper has opened my eyes to the importance of vital creation. Really, honeybees at all. And Mr. Technology. There we go. Okay, good. So my name is Kurt Runzheimer, and I've been a beekeeper in South Central Wisconsin for 25 years. Actually, more than 25 now. So I had an uncle who was a beekeeper growing up, and I probably consumed more honey of his than any other single person. And Minneapolis, and just happened to move down here, so work on Gainesville, and he just retired. Great, we want to learn to be a beekeeper. That was a lot of things. So, a lot of free time. He retired, a lot of time to learn beekeeping, etc. So that was a very important person in my life at the time. And
why is this so low?
So my focus is on harvesting honey production. We harvest only pure raw honey from different floral sources throughout the season. In addition to our summer wildflower honeys, we carefully harvest single source honey like locust honey, which is also pollination honey, basswood honey, clover honey, mullet honey. We can very carefully isolate honeycombs within the hives and comb things are flowering and harvest honey is most interesting. Then there's of course the whole lot of honey. That's just a couple photos of Ben, my son, while I just did. Those are far away. Oh. Okay, these are some pictures over here of just different colors of the different honeys.
There's no arrow next to
it. Sometimes you're amazed about the honeys are not all the same. Very, very different. Some are
on the up arrow next to the microphone icon, bottom left corner of the screen. There's no arrow. Are you supposed to be there, little arrow?
Somebody at home.
If you're at home, you can turn your microphone on. That would be great for the virtual person. But honey's can taste very different. Sweet and light. You can imagine really tasty. So, here we get a chance to try to test them. So, all right, good. And that's my main focus is beekeeping for so,
I don't know.
and I kept reading a lot of different locations in urban Madison and rural land outside of Madison. But on the left, there's a picture of the hives in my own backyard. And I took that the proportion of that picture very well. Way up above there, you look at those trees straight above the hive that have white flowers on. Those are called black locust trees. Those are the trees we make black locust. We make black locust honey. They're going to be flowering usually about the last 2 days of May. They start to flower about June 10th. So if you're not familiar with those, start looking up as you're driving around. We have those stands of them all over the west side. Absolutely beautiful. So, and this is at right near my hives in Blue Mounds, where I used to work on organic farms for many years, and we keep hives up in that area. So those are more the urban bees. And our company is, our business is called City Bee Country Bee Apiaries. Kind of taking the name from like the city mouse, country mouse. believe that each one liked their own world better and thought their world was best. And the city also liked their world, country also liked its world. But beekeeping can be a little bit like that. Urban beekeepers do a little choppy, and these are a little better. Country beekeepers do the same thing, saying I really want to be in the city. But in reality, it takes different care to take care of the different bees, and they both make wonderful honey, and they're really good at what we're doing in the city. So, they just do take different levels of understanding. And we go on, and these are just a couple hives. Other places where I also have clients who write care for them, we'll work with them one-on-one. So these are bees from other places, just showing you how we get ready for winter. It's what we can wait for the hives like that. Which is part of the winter. This is very two hives we care for. Left you can see in the summer how big and tall some of those hives get in the and then the right is winter. And they're right off the north side, the south side, like the north wing, right across the side. It is like a wild.
Well, we can see the pictures, but I can't understand them, Phil.
Hang on a minute, Kurt, we're having trouble, people hearing you at home. We're trying to figure out why.
Do you want, yeah, can you bend the mic closer to your mouth, maybe?
How is that better?
Let me try one thing.
Well, while they're doing that, I'm going to go to one more slide.
Yes, we'll try different.
These are my two favorite.
You see, okay?
This is my daughter, Rachel, and down on the left. Rachel was down on the right. So during the pandemic, we were not at all. We had a wonderful time caring for bees, and then Rachel spent many hours with the bees. We had this a lot of great times. It helped me a lot over the years. So this is Rachel next year. She's my daughter. University of Minnesota. My son Ben, he's a junior at West High School. Oh, he's grown a little since the school. And then the queen bee, like, he was sitting right here a moment ago, but we just realized the program.
So I wonder.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that makes, that's,
Oh, we've got it.
Do you have any questions at this point? This is a little bit about my day-to-day life.
you want to check at the Zoom, if anyone on Zoom has questions too. I don't.
So just double checking the reason you insulate the winter is to keep them alive.
I'll keep it alive more. Yeah. And I'll often go over to one side of the hive and be right against the side. It's a challenge. Yeah.
Oh,
That's a great question.
and we're fine.
These things really aware of what they're doing.
Well, we're watching or trying to watch a the forum on Zoom, so
And they, is they completely aware.
fine.
They're fully awake. In other words, if any
You
moment
going up the lake today?
it's going to fly.
Oh, okay,
They huddle together very tightly.
okay, that's good. Thanks.
They basically shiver.
Yeah, as we up the lake.
And so they generate enough heat to keep them, if they have a queen that's still laying, they can keep it up to 70 degrees temperature. We put some temperature monitor in our hives. And on the big hives, we're reading 75 or 70 degrees all the way. Something that else they want to do that. To do that, you look out there. You don't have enough honey for them, or supplemental food in the right places behind, they run out, they'll freeze to death.
from the top carefully, etc. But they do stay in their hive. If it gets warm, the real trouble is they need to go to the bathroom at some point. If it gets to be 4 months where they can't get out and go to the bathroom, then they can get a problem called Nosema, which is like a dysentery problem where they get diarrhea and they'll die. So, so it's very hard to get them through winter in a northern climate like this. So, yeah.
So how do you process and distribute your honey, or is that later in the presentation?
That's a good question. Hold that till later.
Okay,
So,
thanks.
yeah, you bet. Emily and I have talked about the possibility of like maybe in fall doing a specific program on harvesting honey and how it works. It's a very fun, neat process. But let's see at the end what questions you might have related to that. So, all right, are we good to go? So Rita is the queen bee of our hive, and she keeps it all together behind the scenes. So, so very supportive of my whole family, and they get to be part of the fun too, which is great. So, and my mother and father-in-law, by the way, who are watching with Zoom, Phil and Lois, they have I've known Rita, 27 years now. Probably since the first year I met Rita, they come and help harvest honey every year. And my brother-in-law, Brian, I know is here watching. He and his wife, Renata, everybody in my family comes to help harvest honey. So it's really, it's a huge, huge family operation. I could not honestly do it alone. So, all right. So now moving to the next thing, we'll just talk about the idea of pollinators in general, of which honeybees are a pollinator, right? They're not the only pollinator, not the most important pollinator for lots of things. But in general, so one thing I want to say is all the photos that we have in the presentation, except for I think one slide, are photos we took ourselves. And we are not professional photographers. We use iPhones or maybe my little snap and point and shoot camera. So my point is, if you start to look around and watch carefully, you'll see pollinators all over. I mean, I'm amazed how, for instance, I'll be walking past, yesterday I was out in Cross Plains caring for bees, and I walked past what are a certain hawthorn type bushes are flowering right now. And I was driving my car to the end of the driveway where I was keeping bees. And I said, I'll go check and see what's happening on the hawthorn bush. And I walked up to it, and I thought, not much happening. And I just stopped and looked. And suddenly I know there were like hundreds of native bees on that hawthorn bush. I mean, hundreds. And yet walking by, just glancing, I wouldn't have noticed. So just stop and look at flowers and just see what comes to you. You'll be amazed how many pollinators are in there in many, many kinds of flowers, but you won't notice them if you're just walking by with a casual glance. But you stop and you'll see they're moving in there and working in there. So just a couple comments on pollinators in general. Approximately 3/4 of all flowering plants need help from pollinators to reproduce. That's over 3,000 species of plants worldwide. 300,000 species of plants worldwide. And that's some plants are pollinated more by wind, et cetera. But in terms of needing living creatures to pollinate them, 3/4 of all flowering plants. Over 1,200 different agricultural crops are dependent on pollinators, including 1/3 of all the food we consume and over half of all the oils, fibers, and raw materials. So, I mean, Rhoda, as a fiber artist, could probably tell us more about how you think of certain plants that we use for clothing, for textiles, for an oil-based plants. Those are all dependent, like seed oils, linseed oil, that type of stuff. Those all have to be pollinated as seeds, et cetera. So we're very dependent on our pollinators. Pollinators support ecosystems that clean our air, stabilize soils nutritionally and against erosion, and create beneficial habitat for other wildlife. So when we allow pollinators or flowering plants to flourish in areas, then the pollinators play a big part in keeping those flowers continuous and perennial, and then it has a huge effect on our air, our soils. That's a whole topic about stabilizing soils nutritionally and against erosion. That's something that my kids are really interested into, about how what we do with soils and pollinators is huge. And create beneficial habitat for other wildlife. The last slide of my presentation, we'll refer to that. And then many pollinator populations we know are declining, with the most severe reason being loss of feeding and nesting habitats. So really all pollinators need is habitat, and they will come back. It's amazing. we do just have a little small prairie patch in our backyard, and it blows me away how many pollinators are there day in and day out. You don't need a lot. That's a nice thing as a homeowner. If you're a homeowner or a volunteer at a park or a public garden, it does not take a lot of space and a lot of flowers to bring incredible, bring the incredible pollinators back. So pollution, chemical overuse and misuse, disease, and changing climate are other significant contributors to dropping populations. And those are kind of things you hear about a lot, and they're logical, right? Why would you pollute an environment? Why would we overuse chemicals on the environment? And then of course, there's areas susceptible to diseases for those creatures. And then changing climate, right? You can have a prairie or a certain plant that's thrived somewhere for millennia, and suddenly the climate's changing and they don't thrive there anymore. So there's a lot of, those are all contributing factors to losing habitat for our pollinators. So, all right, so those are just a few general comments about pollinators. And these are just some photos to kind of remind us that hummingbirds, butterflies, native bees are all crucial pollinators, right? So bats are pollinators. Haven't got out at night to take a picture of a bat yet. But if you look at the picture on the left, that picture, if you look up here, you see the monarch right front and center, but look on that zinnia right there. This is just on a patch of zinnias we planted right near our patio. And we looked out one day and we were watching the monarchs, and Rachel says, "Dad, look at that one. You see what's up there, a hummingbird?" It sat there for half hour on that zinnia. So it's just sitting there resting. It was resting on that zinnia. But again, if we never stopped to look, would we have ever noticed that there? No, not at all. But you start to notice, if you stop to look, I'm amazed with small creatures, how many things come to you that you would have never really known or thought were there. So take a look, keep looking carefully. This is one more. This is one that I wish that zoomed in on that. This is a picture of the Agapostamon group of bees, which are often called the green sweat bees or blue sweat bees. It's a little too small, but they're the ones that have the shiny iridescent green thoraxes. Just gorgeous little creatures. And they're out there a lot. That's just one on one of our echinacea plants. And this is, did you take this one, Rachel, the squash? This is just in our plants, right? Our squash in our garden, our pumpkins and squash plants. These are just squash bees. In the morning when the flowers open, just pollinating, 3 or 4 of them in there. So, they're out there. Those are not honeybees. Our honeybees are on the squash plants too, but those are the actual squash bee type of bee. So, and finally, guess what? I took this yesterday when we were out on the back patio, and Rachel's like, "Dad, you see a bumblebee, and I think it's eating the creeping Charlie." And sure enough, I'm like, I got to get a picture of that because everybody hates creeping Charlie, right? And I can't blame us for that. But there's this big bumblebee was in there just loving eating all those creeping Charlie flowers. So creeping Charlie, as you may know, is in the mint family of plants, and honeybees love anything that's in the mint family. You can't go wrong with like your oreganos, your calamint, like Calamintha nepeta is a plant. Oh, they love it. So that's a family you can't go wrong with, except maybe creeping Charlie. But don't get spreading mints or you're in trouble. So anyway, that was just some, they'll look at pollinators in general and the other types of pollinators out there, and they're there. They love flowers. They just need the flowers and the habitat. So, all right. And just a couple things on honeybees as pollinators. This is a picture of a honeybee here on our apple blossoms. We have 2 apple blossoms in our backyard, and it's been fun. They've been open the past few days, and it's just been amazing with the honeybees and the native bees that are on the apple blossoms. Just thousands of them in the trees every day the past few days. So honeybee pollination is a vital necessity in American agriculture, contributing $15 to $20 billion to our agricultural economy. Where honeybees, I'll show you a photo in a moment, but honeybees are moved around to pollinate crops. If you're thinking, how exactly does that work? I'll show you in a minute. Honeybees are transported on pallets by the truckload all over the United States to pollinate many crops. There are many fruits that rely on honeybees for pollination, including apples, peaches, melons, berries, peppers, squash. Some cooking oils, such as canola and sunflower oil, rely on honeybees to maximize their oilseed production. Alfalfa and clover, which are important livestock feeds, also rely on honeybees to maximize pollination. So we use them in a diverse array of places. So blueberries and cherries are 90% dependent on honeybees for pollination. And one of the biggest one you may or may not have heard of is almond pollination. Almonds are entirely dependent on honeybees for pollination. Almost 2/3 or 2 million of all US honeybee colonies are trucked to California every year for 3 weeks in February to pollinate the almond crop. 2/3 of every United States beehive is in California for almond pollination. That's a lot. In one place, in one Central Valley for 3 weeks, the honeybees in the United States all mix and cross. Over 75% of all almonds worldwide are grown in the Central Valley of California. This can have a problematic effects on the health of honeybees. In other words, diseases and parasites as those bees go 3 to 5 miles from their hives, and all these almond groves are there. They're all mixing and crossing and going into each other's hives to see what's all there, et cetera. And that can be a real problem for disease coming out of California when they all mix like that. Here is what that looks like. These are not my photos. These are the ones that aren't my photos. But this is like beekeepers putting their hives literally they operate with forklifts, flatbed trucks. I mean, that's part of their equipment that they own and use to move their hives around for pollination. So these would be, for instance, getting ready to go to almond pollination in California. As you can tell, that's a lot of hives on a single truck. And then they put these big nets over them. And then from California, that's only 3 weeks. You know, things don't flower very long. That's only, honeybees are only of use to that place for flowering, right? And then they get moved somewhere else to melons or cucumbers or whatever. So, 1 second. This is the last one about the pollination. I'll take a couple questions. This is in our yard. That's our apple tree there. That's Rachel when she was little. We have a very magical apple tree. It's easy to climb and it's really fun and it's beautiful and it flowers. And then this is from last year. This is black raspberries that we grow on the side of our garage. And that's Rachel just picking some black raspberries where we have wonderful pollination with 4 to 6 hives in the backyard. We always have a lot more apples than we know what to do with. So you can really see the effects of the honeybees there. So, all right, so that's stuff on pollination. Anybody have any questions? One question for Emily. Emily, what time do we go to?
10:15.
Okay, great.
I'm curious if you, as a beekeeper, then rent your bees out for the almond pollination time.
Great question, but no, I don't. I don't have enough. I do more very small level custom beekeeping where I work hands-on, one-on-one with people or care for hives that people want honey from, et cetera. So I do not. I know people who do and have friends who do, and it's a huge operation because then you have to, get all, just to have the startup to do all that. People are running hundreds and hundreds of hives. I only care for roughly 30 to 40 hives at a time. Yes, David.
So last weekend, we were at the farmer's market at Whitney Way and University Avenue. And the beekeeper there, we just happened to stop because he had all the tasting notes, like wine tasting out. And he had pumpkin, so that intrigued us. But we started to talk. He has 500 hives that he takes to Florida in the wintertime. And he has to go down there every 3 weeks to tend them. So, 500 hives is small compared to the California thing, but that's one of our locals.
Yeah, that's common for Wisconsin beekeepers to have between 500 to 2,000 hives, and then either send them to California for winter or to Florida because the orange pollination, et cetera. Some people take their bees south. Once you have the infrastructure to do it with flatbed trucks and forklifts and stuff, some people just take them down there because it's warmer and the bees can fly and they don't have to spend all winter in their hives. So there's lots of different ways to do beekeeping. Yeah.
How many do you have?
I'd have to do my math in my head right now, but usually between 30 and 40 hives at a time. So it's not my full-time job. It's a part-time job that I do. So there's a lot of ins and outs of how to do things at a very small detail level versus at a big level. There's a lot of differences there. Yeah. Like this afternoon, for instance, I'm hoping to, from like noon, from like 1 to 4:30, I'm going to try to care for 6 or 7 hives very carefully. Whereas you could go to some place and have someone say, I'm just gonna give them a little sugar syrup and feed 40 hives. And, you know, there's different quick ways or bigger ways to deal with honey production and bees, et cetera. But I tend to be a very careful way to do that. So, well, all right. So now moving on, I think. Wait, not that one. Oh, time out. There we go. Okay, so who's in the hive? So what do we have actually going on inside the beehive? This is a slide of the queen. You see her in the middle there? She has a blue dot. We paint our queens. There's a little tube we put them in that has a mesh, almost like when you buy a bag of oranges, it has that red mesh type stuff. We put a little mesh at the end of a cylinder, and with a little soft sponge plunger, we slide her to the end of the tube and mark her with a paint pen. So I mark a different color every year. Last year, all my queens were blue, so I know what year they're from. And so you can see her in the middle there, right there with her blue dot, right? You can see her long abdomen there. That's where her eggs are developing in the abdomen. But really, if that blue dot wasn't there, she wouldn't necessarily jump out at you, right? I mean, I think people think that there's this giant queen in the hive walking around. No, she's not that much different. If they're not marked, you have to be working with a very careful eye. What happens now is she jumps out at you when you're working. You're like, oh, there's the blue dot. There's my queen. But you have to be very careful when you're working. She's not that obvious. And the rest of those most of what you see around are female workers. The little worker bees here, a little bit smaller than the queen. Those are all female workers. And over here, if you can see my arrow drifting, this is a drone right here. They're bigger and plumper than the workers. Right there, that's a drone. It's not the greatest photo of a drone, but you can see how their thorax is big and fuzzy there, that big yellow fuzzy part. So, no. Good question, but of course there's one queen, as we know. We're gonna talk about queens in a moment, but there's one queen, right? She's the only one who lays fertile eggs, and all the rest of the workers are non-fertile females. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's hundreds of drones, whereas there's tens of thousands of workers. There's hundreds of drones. So you'll see drones every time you work in the hive. You'll see them. And we'll talk about what their role is in a little bit, right? But those are the three types of bees in the hive that we see, and then they're all part of one family. Then as we move on, this is looking carefully at the side of a honeycomb. And as you look in there, right, what you see is a lot of little white like worms in there, right? Those are the larvae that the bees are developing larvae, right? So you see in there, especially like in this area, it looks like little coiled up C-shaped larvae. Everybody see that okay in there? Right. So those are the developing larvae at different stages. And some of them, as you'll look and they'll be kind of small and tiny in here. They're a tiny little C shape in there. Some are bigger. That's just depends how old they are. Then at day 9, after 9 days as a larva, the bees will put this brown casing over the top, and it will become a pupa. Right? So then the bee gets covered from day 9 to 21, the worker bees. They're covered with what's called a capping like that. And inside there, the larva spins its cocoon, and then it'll develop into an adult. And then at day 21, it will chew its way out of that casing, and a young adult bee will come out. And you can almost always see that when you're working in the hive. The queen lays so many eggs, up to like 2,000 a day, that somewhere in the hive at that rate, there are bees emerging. It takes them maybe 5 to 10 minutes to chew out of there. You'll see the area. You can always find the area where they're chewing their way out. You'll see the little antennas coming out, and they'll work their way out and chew their little cap off. So, so that's kind of what happens in life. And now what I don't have in there is eggs, because I don't know if I could take a photo careful enough to see eggs in there. But I mean, if you look right in here, you can see like what looks like a tiny white, almost piece of rice at the bottom of those holes. Can anybody see that? There's a tiny little egg at the bottom. Now, what I did is the other day I was working with my bees, and they were building a little extra comb off the bottom of one of their regular honeycombs. And this, they were laying eggs in here. This is a drone comb. They love to build drone combs, even though the drones have no use except for reproduction. But if you hold this right in the light, every one of these holes in the middle has an egg in it that the queen has laid. All right. And you can pass that around. I mean, I don't care if it gets mashed, it's going to get mashed up for candle wax, but keep it nice so that you all can see in those holes. And note this is an eye test to see how your eyes are, to see if you can see the egg at the bottom. When you look in there, you can hold it up to the light, you can turn it at different angles and see if you can see if this is one of the holes, the egg is like this big in the middle. It's tiny, but you can see them if you look carefully. Doug, did you see them? Okay. And you'll get the bottom, the hexagons overlap from front to back. So you'll see the pattern of the hexagon coming through the hole from the other side. Don't let that confuse you. So, all right, so you can see if you can notice the eggs in there. Try it at different angles to the light, etc. But it looks like a teeny, tiny little piece of rice at the bottom of that hole. All right, so that's the stages of the bee's development. Then we go on. This is a frame that someone who works with me is holding up. And in the middle here, those are all pupa, right? The developing pupa. The bees will, this is what I would call a very healthy frame where the bees are developing nicely in the middle here. They have a clear edge to where the brood is. And then this area where there's this sort of dull yellow color out here. And then on the other side over here where there's this yellow color, that's the pollen that they're collecting from the flowers. And they bring the pollen in and ideally they put it right along the side of their brood nest like that. And that's what they feed their young. The larvae eat the pollen. The adults aren't pollinators. That's the food for their developing larvae. So when you see the bees carrying the pollen on their legs, the little yellow pouches of pollen, those go for the young, to feed the young. They come back and they push it in those holes with their heads and they add some enzymes and a little bit of sweetness to it, et cetera. And then that's called bee bread. And that gets taken back out to feed the larvae. So, and then on the far edge here, this is honey that's capped. They keep the honey on the outside then. So that's kind of what would look like a nice healthy frame of developing bees, pollen, and honey. The adults eat the honey. That's the food for the adults. So now here's who we don't like in the hive. These are varroa mites. So that white stuff there, this white stuff is the larvae that I've pounded out of a frame. So when you saw that frame with all those developing larvae, I pounded those out to show what's happening with the hive that's infested with varroa mites. All right, they're the worst enemy of the beekeeper. So here you can see this is just a developing piece of honeycomb that's raising young bees. All those pupa are in there developing. I just took it out, broke it in half, and you can see the mites are these little brown specks. And they're smaller than a sesame seed, but they're clearly visible. And they go into the developing brood like this. And when that brown capping goes on the brood, they're underneath there living in. This is a side view of like a honeycomb that's been broken apart over here. It's a side view of it from the two sides where the bees are capped and developing. The mites are in there reproducing and they feed on that larvae and they destroy the developing bees. They parasitize them, but even worse, they spread viruses and funguses with their mouth parts. And then they come out and they go into more larvae and they divide and multiply and they increase very quickly. And so that's when you hear about colony collapse disorder and all these sort of problems facing the bees in terms of the actual biology of the bees. It's mostly due to the varroa mite and its complications. So if the varroa mites can be kept under control, almost every other problem with the bees is manageable by hive care. So the varroa mites are the real big enemy though. So there you go. If you've ever sat thinking, what is all the problems with these honeybees they're talking about? They all mostly stem from varroa mites. So, and secondly, public enemy number 2, but way less than number 1, is the wax moth. That's a big plump, what's called the greater wax moth larva right there in the middle. And they get into the honeycombs and what all these creatures want is, well, not the varroa mites, they want to parasitize the bees, but wax moths, they want the pollen because it's protein. And they go in and they lay their eggs. The moths come in at night and they lay their eggs in the combs and that's what happens. Those are the wax moths make that stringy stuff and it shreds up and they eat and they chew and destroy the honeycombs very quickly. So they're another problem. You store your equipment in the garage, you better wrap it up with plastic wrap very tight or they'll get in there and destroy it. So, all right, so that's who's in the hive, good and bad. Does anybody have any questions about that? question for, oh, is there another question over there?
How do you combat the mites?
Well, there's a bunch of different strategies. So the most common is to use some sort of chemical intervention, but then there's organic chemical intervention and pharmaceutical type chemical intervention. And I only use what are called the organic acids, formic acid and oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is what gives rhubarb its sour taste, right? Or spinach, Swiss chard, they contain oxalic acid. That's almost now entirely what I use is oxalic acid. It's a little heating element that takes crystallized oxalic acid. You can buy it at the hardware store as wood bleach. It's just pure oxalic acid. It's 100% organic acid. And it sublimates it immediately from solid to gas. And the pressure in this little cooker pushes into the hive in a big cloud like that. So that's one option. Formic acid is another, which is a more dangerous acid, but it's still an organic acid. It's an ingredient in honey. It's ingredient in bee venom and ant venom. But it's very dangerous to breathe. So you have to wear gas masks and everything, but that's another agent to get rid of the mites. And then there's the harsher chemicals like livestock miticides, like for ear mites and ear ticks and cattle and stuff like that. But if that touches your honey, it's toxic. So I don't use any of those at all, just the organic acids. Then there's strategies where you take the brood out and destroy the brood of the hive, like I was showing you in there, where they pounded the brood out to get rid of the mites. You lose your brood, but you can clear it of mites or help clear it of mites. So there's challenging strategies that beekeepers are constantly working on. So, all right, so from there, I just thought we'd take a couple of minutes and look at the amazing queen bee, because not we all, but many are. The questions quickly go to who is the queen bee and how does that all work, right? Why can she lay eggs? Why can't the other females? All that. So this is a queen. Same queen as I had the different picture of before. And so the queen is the only one who can lay eggs in the hive. And the reason that is due to a substance. Now, you'll see this in just a moment, but back with that picture of the larvae and all those holes with all those little larvae, I don't know if you noticed that it seemed like there was almost like a white milky substance under some of those larvae, like there was shiny liquid in there that looked kind of like white milk almost. That's a substance called royal jelly. And it's a substance that the young nurse bees, the very young bees in the hive, secrete out of the glands in their head and secrete it through their mouth, and they feed it to the developing larvae. So when you look at the little tiny young larvae in there, they'll be sitting in this little milky white pool of what's called royal jelly. And that is the substance that allows their hormonal development to happen and their reproductive organs to start developing. And the larvae get royal jelly, or they're only fed royal jelly for about 3 to 4 days worth of royal jelly, and then they're stopped. And so the female worker bees, their ovaries won't develop to become reproductive organs. And that's intentional. But for a queen, this is how bees raise queens naturally in their own hive. You look on the left, these are what are called queen cells, right? We were just saying these right here. These are the queen cells right here. Uh-oh, timeout. Oh no, what am I doing? Wait. Oh, timeout. There we go. So these are queen cells. What's that? Yeah. Oh, thanks, Ben. Yeah. So these are the queen cells, these vertical cells. The queen, they hang the queens vertical off the side, whereas the little black holes up on top, you mind pointing those about, Ben? The larvae get raised in those little horizontal holes, right? Like I was showing you before in the slides. Those are the queen cells developing. They hang off the side like that. And if we take one of those at the bottom, that's the queen's pupa hanging down, much bigger than the little holes. But if I took one of those on the left and cut the end off and looked inside, over here on the right, can you point out the larva in there? It's not a little hard to tell, but there's a larva sitting in there. Do you see that? It's kind of an off-white color, and there's that pool of white substance. That's called royal jelly, and that's what they secrete. And they secrete for queens enough to feed the queen for her entire development. Even when she pupates, there's still more. Once she pupates, becomes a pupa, then she doesn't eat royal jelly anymore. But for her, she gorges. That larva can gorge itself on royal jelly for the full 9 days before it goes into its pupa phase. And that allows her organs to develop and become a functioning reproductive female. And really the only difference is that they've chosen to take the larvae that were in those little horizontal holes, and when something must have happened to the queen or they wanted a new queen, they'll open that hole up and they'll recreate that cell so that one little larva that was destined to become a worker bee, they start back feeding it with royal jelly and it can become a queen. So if I go into my hive and I just squish a queen, they'll figure out some larvae in the hive and they will quickly turn them into queen cells to make queens. So theoretically, every female worker bee's life starts with the possibility to become a reproductive queen. They just don't feed them enough royal jelly to do that. And why that's important is now if we want to raise queen bees, what we have to do is create a large queenless colony. So this was last year's large queenless colony in my backyard. I just took frames of developing bees and the bees on the frames and just start taking them from different hives and accumulating them in this big pile of tall boxes. They're just tall, skinny boxes. I'll go out to a place, take 5 frames of bees and developing larvae and just start stacking them up with no queen in that hive. And then when the time is right, when I've decided, I know the age of those bees that I'm taking. And when the age of those bees is right, and there's no queen in the hive, then we can create more queen bees because that hive is yearning to have a queen. And what we do is basically we take those little red cups. Do you mind pointing out, Ben? Those little red cups are going to become, they're going to be hung upside down. They're going to become artificial queen cells or human created queen cells. So what I do then is I go in the combs and I find a little larvae like that. About the size of they say about the size of a comma on a printed page. Like if you're reading a book, it's about the size of a comma, tiny. And you can see the milky substance underneath it. That larva is only about a day old from when it's egg hatched. And it is feeding on royal jelly. Like I was saying, every 3 to 4 days, they get that royal jelly. And at that point, that still has the potential to become a queen, any larva in the hive that's that young. So we isolate a larva like that, or as many as we're going to use. And then we go in with that tool right there. You can't see the end of that white tool has a clear end on it, a little clear, thin plastic blade on the end of that. And we go into that hole and we take that little tiny, tiny larva out of there. And that has a little plunger on it. So we take it out of there and we move it into one of those cups. Can you point out the larvae in there, Ben? As a little, you kind of see the little larvae in there. It's very hard to see. And then that plunger, it has a gentle end on it that slides the larva into that little cup. And so now we've taken that larva with some of its royal jelly and put it in that cup. And we do that whole red row of those little red cups. We take them inside and we do all of them at the same time. And let's say I have a hive that's like a good honey producer. The bees are nice and they survive winter well and they don't swarm much. We might choose those larvae to become the daughters that we want, because that's how you genetically choose for the bees you like. You take the traits you like, and then those are the ones you graft. This is called grafting. Right? We graft the larva from those little, I could go out to those hives that day and take a frame of fresh larva from those hives, and we graft it into those little cups. And then after 48 hours on the left, so point out those are different colored cups, red, yellow, green, they come in different colors. But in those are 48 hours, they'll look like that. Now look inside that, like that green cup there, Ben. Can you point to that? Do you see how it's go way up to the cup? That cup where we put the larva at the bottom, do you see how it's now white in there? It's solid white color. That's the royal jelly. In 48 hours, the bees will secrete that much royal jelly behind that little larva. They'll lift that larva up that I put in that cup and they'll backfill it with royal jelly because it's now vertical and they think that needs to become a queen. And they'll fill those in 48 hours to that point. In 96 hours, we have that. Those are now queens that have, because that larva was, it has 3 days as an egg, then the larva is born. And after the larva is a day old, then we graft the larva. So it's really about a day 5 or day 4 larva. So after 4 or 5 more days, now it becomes its pupa, and only 4 days after grafting it. And those are beautiful developing queen cells like that. So, and now we can, so they say, well, what do we do with all those? We've got this queenless hive with all those queen cells. then you know how, do you see how it kind of looks almost like a morel mushroom? That's a sign of healthy queen cells. I've learned that over the years. When you raise queen cells, you want them to have that. It's a stabilizing effect to the queen cell. And if the bees are really healthy, they'll build that around the cell. So we know those are really good, healthy queen cells. And they filled those cups full of royal jelly. Then after the right time, we take each one of those cells and I put them on like a little T-bar like that. And then, so you can see I removed one of those plastic cups and I put it onto that little wooden brace piece. And that's going to hang down. So what we do is we take that big group of all those tall boxes. You can see on the slide on the right, we divide them up into what are called mating nukes. And we take some of those bees and then just one of those queen cells and put it in each one of those little boxes. And some go out to other places. And now that group can protect that queen cell. The queen will be born and ideally she'll mate and come back and be a new fertile queen. But she still has to go out and mate in nature. Some beekeepers artificially inseminate, where you can actually, like with cows, you can take the sperm from the males and inseminate the female queens. We don't do that. We just do it. We let them go out in nature and mate and come back in. So sometimes they don't make it. Sometimes they do. But so.
That blows my mind.
Yes.
How tiny the larva is.
Yeah.
How on earth would you artificially somehow find this? It just seems like it would be so minuscule. I don't understand. I can't.
It's a microscopic, or it's not microscopic, but it's a magnification. You would use a microscope for magnification. I mean, but yeah, basically there's a way to take the drones and get their sperm out of the drones from the hives you want. So again, that way you can pick from where the other half of the reproduction is coming from. If the queens, we can choose which queens we choose from the hive. We can't choose the drones when they mate in nature, but you can that way. So you can take your drones and you can take the sperm out of their body and mix it up and put it in a syringe and inject the queens basically. So that's not my area of expertise, but it's been done for a while and it's done well when people do it well. So yeah, so that's kind of how we raise queens. I think the most important thing to remember is every worker larva that's less than where the developing larva is only 1 or 2 days, it's still eating royal jelly and it's viable to become a queen if need be. So people always ask, what happens if you kill your queen? They'll raise more. They have she lays 2,000 eggs a day. She's bringing up 4,000 larvae in the hive that are still young enough to feed, to survive as a queen. So from there, there we go. This is just a little thing about increasing pollinator habitat. All right, so just keep in mind that increasing pollinator habitat is crucial and beneficial. That is Ben right there. We're at the, I don't know if the technical term is the Odana Prairie, but it's the one that's at the end of Odana Golf Course. And if you ever park at the far end of the golf course parking lot and then walk through the little trail to go to the bike path, the main bike path there, that's that big prairie right there. Things like that to a beekeeper are just invaluable. They're just, and to our world for pollinators, right? But I'm just speaking as a beekeeper. I mean, I can go into there and just, my honeybees just absolutely are all over places like that. So when the city or a wonderful group like the people who do that prairie, it's just so good for me. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, they're gorgeous areas, just beautiful, but they're so beneficial. As this has been, sometimes we just harvest a few seeds and he'll raise them and take them back and plant them in our yard. So he's got this cool little two prairie areas going on in our yard. But yeah, just to look in there and see what's all there, it's amazing. So anyway, because the main threat to pollinator populations is loss of habitat, the most important thing we can do collectively is to increase their habitat. And after all the years of beekeeping, et cetera, I still feel that's the most important thing, is just to give them habitat. In urban and suburban areas, often small intermittent patches of habitat are all that is needed to let local pollinators thrive. Often cities actually have more diverse pollinator populations due to the wide variety of flowering plants, which is amazing. Along that note, I don't know, some of you, if you watch PBS, recently they re-showed the nature episode called My Garden of 1,000 Bees. Yeah, if you have a PBS passport, if you donate to PBS, go into the nature show section and look for that one. It's one of their wildlife photographers was stuck at home during the pandemic and did a actual episode in his backyard in London on pollinators. It's really, really good. That's a testament to like, here's this, and he was just in a small yard, and you look at his yard and you're like, that was a little messy, a little overgrown, but the pollinators in there that he could find and film were unbelievable. In rural areas, large scale farming has often stripped the land of natural pollinator habitat, right? You know, the big monocropping of corn and soybeans, which has its place in the world, but it does not have pollinator habitat is the reality, right? However, we are finding that adding natural habitat areas back into the landscape is very beneficial. Farms that turn a small portion of their land back into green space actually improve overall yields as the habitat attracts pollinators back into the area. The same has been shown to be true for urban community gardens as well. And that's my daughter Rachel works at a pollinator research project in summer at the Landscape Ecology Lab. And there, one of the things they were looking at is how that affects organic farms, right? How the pollinator diversity at organic farms is affected by having natural pollinator space devoted simply for flower development of pollinators. So in other words, they're finding is that by farms taking a portion of what would be cropland and donating it back to just prairie growth or wildflower growth is actually, the yields are actually higher and more beneficial. So there's really no end to the places that we could be, there's really no end to the places that could be used for pollinator habitat. Along highways and roads, along parks and golf courses, and small areas and yards are just a few possibilities. So that's a big one for me. I look at the median strips in Madison, and it's so hard to see that, like, just to me, just when they're coming into full fruition of like white clover development, mow them down. So that's one might be on my agenda for the future to try to figure out how. And then I just read an article, we don't have enough. The city doesn't have it in its budget to afford mowing, so they're going to turn them back into concrete. And it's like, just don't mow them. Just leave them for the bees in summer. It's unbelievable. The white clover for honeybees. I mean, not every bee, but there's so many bees that love white clover, and it just starts getting really nice and rich in those median strips. I look at all the school yards in summer. Most of them are abandoned in summer, right? And they're just all white clover. They mow them down every week, and it's heartbreaking to see. So anyway, but again, a small spot in your own yard can make a huge difference. Here's, and do appreciate when you see those prairies out there, you know, the people who take time to care for them, et cetera, they're really amazing. If you've never been to that Odana prairie, it's a great hike sometime. If you want to go on the bike trail and walk past that prairie, you can hike through it with these little trails. It's just gorgeous. And those are all over. I mean, there's people dedicated to doing that more and more, which is wonderful. That's really what our world needs. So, so here,
Kurt,
finally, oh yeah, Nancy.
yeah. I'm not going to talk about the the prairie. I understand about that. But what about all these ephemerals? I have what might be called domesticated plants, but I have all kinds of wildflowers coming up hither and yon, whether it's Dutchman's breeches or trillium or bloodroot, any of those. Are they too early for pollinators?
No, they're great. You know, really, I mean, flowers that pollinators want, you know, so any of like just in our yard a little bit, but in some of our yards, like the Siberian squill or the trilla flowers. Oh, I didn't include a photo of the bees. It's the one time a year the bees bring in blue pollen. So in the hive, the bees are all walking around with blue pollen on their legs. It's the most gorgeous thing you'll ever see. And it's from the scillas, which are, you know, you get a warm day in early April when those are flowering, and they'll bring it in. Yeah. So yeah, you bet. So any flowers you have are important, definitely. This is what I just wanted to end with. This is my favorite example of honeybees and restored habitat working together. So these are 4 hives that I have tucked in Research Park. And there's the MG&E Innovation Center in there. And these are behind there. So this is kind of a picture in very, very early spring, late winter, where you can see the grass mowed by the building. You can see the 4 beehives. And out in front is, I don't know if you're familiar, but University Research Park has 20-some acres of prairie habitat restored running through their buildings, around and in and around the building. It's a balance between perfectly pedicured lawns and wild space. And you can see that here. So this is in spring now, about now, or maybe another week or 2 from now. You can see from a different angle looking at the hives how it's starting to become this rich green plants, or, you know, all the prairie is starting to come up now in front of the hives. And then turn it to midsummer, and it's just beautiful. It's just solid flowers, and it's like heaven for the bees. They just, yellow, pink, purple, the whole bit, all sorts of wildflowers in there. So they spend all summer feeding on that incredible land that they're right there next to. And then in fall, it turns over to asters and goldenrod, which makes incredible honey as well. The September honeys are just beautiful. So this prairie turns over all the way from, well, right now it's got a lot of the wild mustard flowering in there. It's just starting, and the bees love that. So really from April till October, it's gorgeous. And then all that plant matter turns brown, right? Ends for the year, turns brown. And as I mentioned way back when, it creates habitat for other creatures during the winter. There's a lot of a nice coyote population, I know, in the research park, et cetera. But here's my favorite. One winter, this little critter was here by my hives and spent the winter living right near the hives in the old prairie growth, this little deer, and he was very, very friendly. And he just every time came up and wanted to see what was going on. Just right there in Research Park, he spent the winter. So, so it's kind of a neat, the whole pollinator prairie, it includes more than just the bees, just for healthy life for animals, et cetera. So, yeah. So thanks for watching. One last comment about this slide. I think the monarch was in the prairie, the Odana Prairie where we were at. But over there on the left, you can see the honeybee in the middle of that frame. Everybody, Nancy, can you see that? There's a honeybee right here in the middle. And those are the black locust flowers that'll be coming out in about 2 weeks. If you're not familiar with that tree, just look up and look around on the 1st of June, and those trees will be flowering, and you'll probably smell them before you see them. They're gorgeous. The bees at Research Park, if they fly out of their hives, it's less than, it's probably a half mile as the bee flies to hit the belt line. And Schrader Road is on the other side of the belt line. The entire Schrader Road canopy is black locust trees. So they only flower strong every other year usually. And this is their year to flower well. So hopefully those bees will make some black locust honey off those trees. And especially, not especially, but definitely in urban environments, people forget is how important trees are. The trees are unbelievable. The silver maples, for instance, which we have a lot of, people plant a lot of silver maples. That's their first major pollen source, is silver maple trees. And you see, are you familiar with the red flowers of the silver maples? And then when they're done flowering, you get a rain and they're all on the pavement. Like, what is all that stuff? And it's all the red flowers that have fallen on the trees. That's their first source way back in sometimes late March into early April. And now you're looking, or like a week ago, we looked out and said, oh, look at all the leaves are starting to come up. But if you walk up to most of the trees in the city that are maples, it's not the leaves, it's the green flowers. And those are huge sources of pollen for the bees, not nectar, but pollen, so they can feed their young to get their populations going. So in the city, our early flowering trees that we plant on the city boulevards and stuff, and people in their yards with silver maples, et cetera, are huge for bee pollen production. And then you get the crab apples. Bees love the city plants, the crab apples. The basswood and linden trees, which are planted for summer, that's a major honey source of the urban bees, is the basswood / linden group, Telia genus. They bring in a lot from that. And our city plants a lot of different species of linden trees. Our parking lot out here has linden trees. And this is not going to be their year, theoretically. Last year was their year, and next year. This year will probably be low. But last year, if you looked in the parking lot at our church, the small leaf linden trees, it was just loaded with flowers and honeybees and smelled heavenly. So, all right. Yeah. So, great.
So you should know that Kurt also teaches yoga. Tuesday and Thursdays, he's here in the morning.
Right.
teaching.
Yeah.
He also is the construction manager of the raised beds out here that we have for the garden.
Well, not as much now, but
But you,
the rain barrel.
You built the bed. You built the.
It's true. We did build them, and yeah. So, but yeah, definitely. So a lot of people are involved, especially Jeff and David. So, but thanks for coming, and I'm happy to stick around if anybody else has any other questions. So,
And next week is the last forum of the year, and it's going to be the director of Olbrich Gardens that'll be here.
is it Jeff?
No,
Good.
it's what I forgot. What?
Oh, Tanya.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think she's new there.
Okay, super, awesome. Yeah, definitely. Jeff, I think, is the grounds guy. He's the true plant, literal dirt plant guy. So he does the gardens, manages the gardens. So right, that's a very, very important title, the dirt person. All right, well, thanks everybody. All right.